Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of our Explain the Basics series. This week's episode is titled Spec Sheet Basics. We'll be covering all the key terminology you'll find on your standard IP camera specification sheet, from megapixels to aperture, WDR to DNR, and more. So let's get started with megapixel. Well, the simplest way to explain megapixel is to say that 1 megapixel is a million pixels. Now, pixels are the tiny squares that make up the surface of a camera's digital image sensor. And so with each megapixel you get an extra million pixels. For example, 2 megapixels is 2 million pixels, 4 megapixels is 4 million pixels, and so on and so on. What's important to point out with megapixels is that the image sensor doesn't get any bigger in most cases as you increase the number of pixels. Instead, the pixels just get smaller and closer together. What happens when you squeeze more pixels in is that you get a larger resolution of image, as you can physically stretch the image much further before you begin to see the pixels and before the image becomes pixelated. FPS. FPS stands for frames per second. Now, if you didn't already know, moving images are made up of thousands of stills or frames run together to create the illusion of movement. The smoothest image processor in the world is the human eye, which views the world around 150 frames per second. Now compare that to your standard HD video camera, which records a much slower 25 to 30 frames per second, and IP cameras that record even slower at around 12 frames per second. Now you might be wondering why we don't use more frames if our eyes are capable of understanding more. Well, the simple answer is storage space. To help you understand, I'll give you an example. If you record 6 4 megapixel IP cameras for 7 days at 30 frames per second, you'll need 4.8 terabytes of storage space. Compare this to recording the same setup at 12 frames per second, then you're only using 2.4 terabytes. So if you don't want to be spending extortionate amounts of money on storage, then you won't want to record any higher than 12 to 15 frames per second. Aperture. Aperture is used with cameras to describe the diameter of the camera's iris, and like the iris of your eye, the camera's iris opens and closes to let different amounts of light reach the camera's sensor. Now there is a scale for measuring the aperture of a camera. It starts at f1.4, which is fully open, and goes all the way down to f16 or 22 depending on your lens, which is as closed as it will go while still allowing light through. The best way of describing how the aperture works is to compare it to an hourglass. When the aperture is wide open, all the available light is allowed to reach the sensor, and when the aperture is small, the light hitting the sensor is narrowed and dimmed. Focal length. Cameras have lenses, and these lenses have focal lengths, which are used as a guide for the field of view of your camera. Now, focal length is measured in millimeters, which is confusing because when we talk about field of view, we talk in angles. So what does the millimeter measure correspond to? Well, it's actually the distance between the sensor and the back of the lens. Changing this distance is what changes the field of view of your camera, and the best way to help visualize this is to think of the lens as a cardboard tube. If you were to scale it up and hold a 3 cm tube up to your eye, what you would see out of the end would be much wider than what you would see out of the end of a 12 cm tube. The only exception, obviously, is varifocal cameras, as these have a mechanism inside the lens that physically moves the glass inside towards and away from the sensor. Resolution. Resolution is a measurement of the height and width of your camera's video output in pixels. For example, 640 by 480, that's 640 pixels wide by 480 pixels tall. Because resolution is measured in pixels, you can use the height and width numbers to work out how many megapixels your camera has. So for example, if you had an output image that was 1920 by 1080, all you would have to do is multiply 1920 by 1080, which equals 2,073,600 pixels, which converted into megapixels equals 2 megapixels. Lux. Lux is a unit of measurement used to measure the amount of available light in a specific location, and with IP cameras it is used to illustrate the smallest amount of light required for your cameras to still capture an image. To give you an idea of how the scale works, an overcast night lit only by starlight registers as the lowest measurement at a tiny 0.001 lux. At the other end of the scale for IP cameras is a clear night sky illuminated by a full moon, which tops out at about 0.36 lux. Most IP cameras' lowest lux will fall somewhere on this scale, but now with advancing sensor technology and the introduction of IR technology, it is actually possible to go right down to absolute zero lux, but we'll talk more about this and IR in another video. DNR. DNR stands for Digital Noise Reduction. Digital noise is something that occurs when there are irregular fluctuations in the transmission of electrical signals to and from your camera. The simplest way to describe it is to say that it is the video equivalent of phone static, and just like static, digital noise is very unpredictable, and understandably customers were beginning to get annoyed as they were spending hundreds of pounds on expensive cameras which then only produced a noisy image. Now what DNR does is continuously scan the image to identify the noise or image artifacts and automatically repair said noise. WDR. WDR stands for Wide Dynamic Range. Now if you know anything about photography, you might recognise the term as most DSLRs feature the setting. The way WDR works for IP cameras is slightly different but achieves the same effect. Because it's video instead of stills, what the Wide Dynamic Range does is scan a picture for under and overexposed areas and then adjusts how the sensor records those areas of the image to stop any areas becoming too bright or dark. Thank you for watching and subscribing. If you haven't subscribed already, please do by clicking here. Check the description below for links to our Facebook, Twitter and Google Plus feeds. Follow the link here for our web shop, and if you want more videos like this, click the playlist up here. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.